So listen to this. Today's story is about a random guy who managed to convince everyone he was a professional footballer, playing for 26 years across 11 clubs, everywhere from France to Mexico, Saudi Arabia, and every Brazilian team in the book, sharing a locker room with the likes of Romário and Zico without ever touching a football. He was the greatest con man in the history of the sport, from faking injuries to bribing ball boys, starting riots, lying to mob bosses, and impersonating famous footballers. He would do anything to convince everyone he was a football superstar, except playing football. And in the end, it all crumbled like a house of cards. Turns out he was lying about even more than people were aware of. Trust me, his story will keep you on your toes till the very last second. Let's go. So, it's difficult to decide where to start. Even Kaiser himself is not quite sure, but I'd say, first of all, I have to present to you Renato Gaúcho. He was once called the perfect citizen, he had everything. So good at football that he took Grêmio to an Intercontinental Cup trophy. So good looking he made every magazine cover, so charismatic that even his rivals loved him, and he was a ladies' man like no other. He has literally said, "I've been with more women than Pelé has scored goals." The thing is, Kaiser was obsessed with him. Not that that was very special, pretty much everyone was, but Kaiser took it a bit too far. At that point he was already going around, but his scams were more moderate. It was just smaller time clubs where he did the most to make sure he never had to play. But then he began styling his hair like Renato, dressing like Renato, speedo and sunglasses, the whole shebang, and sooner than later someone mistook him for Renato and the brightest of bulbs lit up in Kaiser's head. From that day on, wherever he went, he was Renato Gaúcho. His teammates would find him in shopping malls, surrounded by people giving away autographs. He would go to nightclubs and get free drinks, free meals, free everything. Even the women would throw themselves at him, a different one every night, sometimes more than one. Because in everyone's eyes, he was Renato Gaúcho and everyone loves Renato Gaúcho. Until there was a little problem. Renato was a married man at that point, and the stories started going around. "Oh, I saw him making out with 5 different girls the other night." 5? I saw at least 7. And sooner or later, those stories made their way to his wife, and trust me, she wasn't about to believe that it was all an imposter. But thankfully, soon after, Renato was about to walk into a club when the bouncer went, "Do you think I'm dumb? Renato is inside already." And soon after, the two worlds collided, but Renato wasn't even mad. In his own words, it's not like he robbed anyone, and strangely enough, they actually became good friends. If I had to make a guess, I'd say perhaps there was a reason Renato enjoyed having the excuse of an imposter going around having sex with endless women that weren't his wife. Speaking of that, there was more in it than just sex for Kaiser. He would literally have women paying him for the act, thinking they were getting to sleep with a sex symbol that was Renato Gaúcho. He wasn't just a scammer, he was an entrepreneur. Which reminds me, it was at that moment that he realized, wait, if I can convince everyone I'm a football superstar, why not convince an entire football club? And so, it started. First step, tell everyone that he was nicknamed Kaiser because he was the next Beckenbauer. No one needs to know that Kaiser is a beer brand in Brazil, or that he was nicknamed after it because he was constantly downing one after the other. Second step, go to Europe. It's the 1980s, a Brazilian passport is all you need to convince any club that you're the next Zico. Step number 3, enjoy your hard-earned career. That's pretty much how Kaiser landed in France, according to him. With a handful of lies, he arrived at Ajaccio, supposedly suggested to them by Fábio Barros, another Brazilian who had played there. They were so excited to welcome the great Carlos Kaiser, a certified Brazilian superstar, according to himself, that they set up an entire presentation ceremony, packed stadium, kissing babies, getting flowers from the president's wife, even waving the flag of Corsica, a dream come true. But once they asked him to do some kick-ups, it nearly turned into a nightmare. Had it not been for Kaiser's quick thinking, grabbing the balls and kicking them into the stands, saying they were souvenirs for the fans, to which he got a standing ovation. As he said it himself, from that moment on, he could have been there for 10 years without playing. The fans loved him. And so, he didn't waste any time. As he warmed up for the first match, he sprinted 10 meters and fell on the floor clutching his leg. From there on out, he was always injured. The coach hated him. I think he could see right through him, but on the other hand, the vice president of the club loved him. They say he was a member of the Corsican Mafia, and for some reason, he protected Kaiser like a son, saying that even if he doesn't play, it's great for the club's marketing to have a South American star. And that one excuse ensured he stayed there for a while before they finally decided to send him on loan back to Brazil, which meant Kaiser had to find himself a new team. But this time around he had something new. Credibility. After all, he had played in Europe, and not many could afford to say that back in the day, but still, that wasn't enough. Kaiser would claim that he had played for Indpendiente before Ajaccio, that he was with them when they beat Barcelona in the Intercontinental Cup final, and if you don't believe him, go look at the lineups. Carlos Henrique. His name is right there, except an age is missing, and it's actually pronounced Enrique because that one is Argentinian. But at first glance, it seemed believable enough, and so did the photo he somehow had of himself training with Paris Saint-Germain, or the never-ending calls he had with the Barcelona president, who was apparently very interested in signing him, even though he would rather stay in Brazil. You gotta realize, Kaiser was no bum. He was in great shape. Anyone who looked at him was immediately inclined to believe he was some kind of athlete. So soon enough, he found himself at Bangu. His only goal was to get his signing bonus, then to fake an injury for a while, and to run away the moment he raised any suspicions. But there was one problem. Bangu's president was an odd man, Dr. Castor, one of the richest men in Brazil. He was a household name, involved in everything, even the carnival. He looked like a harmless old man, but appearances are misleading. All the money had come from running an illegal gambling ring, trafficking of pretty much anything, and when it came to football, he only seemed to become even more aggressive. He would go around lighting up his cigar with a $100 bill, a revolver tucked into his pants. He would even make the players kiss his hand like he was the Pope. They were all terrified of him. They told Kaiser about the time a player got injured before a big match. He was on the floor crying. Castor came down from the stands, walked slowly towards him, pulled out his revolver and shot the floor next to him. The guy got up and started running. He told him, "See, clearly you can still play tomorrow." Kaiser had definitely met his match. Regardless, Castor had bought most of Brazil's World Cup winning squad and brought Bangu from being irrelevant to losing out on the Brazilian championship by an inch. Just one missed penalty, and they thought Kaiser would be the one to take them just that 1 inch further. The newspapers read, "Bangu as a new king, Carlos Kaiser." And he was all up for it. He even paid off the ball boy to ask people in the stands to sing out his name in order to convince Castor that he was a big deal. And it worked. The man loved Kaiser. He was always in his office just chatting and joking around with him, playing with fire. Soon he was like the image of the club, their PR manager, as he likes to call himself. Whenever the coach wanted him gone, 20 players would come to argue in his favor. He was always injured, but everyone loved him. He would arrive to training in a van overflowing with women like a clown car. He would introduce the other players to celebrities. He would get them into VIP nightclubs. He was the man. Until he wasn't. It was simple. The team began getting bad results, so one night he got a call at 4 a.m. telling him he had to be present for the game the next day, but not to worry because he would be kept on the bench. He went on about his life, arriving at the team's hotel so late that the other players were already waking up. But when the match finally started, they asked him to warm up. It was time to play. It was a red alert. Kaiser's brain was going 100 miles per hour when he finally figured it out. With a few fans insulting him from the stands, he climbed the fence, began fighting them, and got himself a red card. It was the perfect plan, until Castor, more than fed up with his antics at this point, grabbed his revolver and a bunch of his security guards and met Kaiser in the locker room. It seemed it was the end for him. Castor was yelling at him, completely out of his mind, but then Kaiser went, "Before you say anything more, let me say just this one thing. I'm sorry I did that, but I couldn't let the fans insult you like that, calling you a criminal when you've been like a father to me. I'm sorry, but in 15 days my contract ends. At least, just let me leave." I wish I was lying, but Castor legitimately ate it all up and was so impressed with his supposed loyalty that he offered him a contract renewal and doubled his salary. Still, Kaiser knew it was time to leave, so he began self-promoting once again. This time, it was an offer from Olympiacos, interviews claiming he was the best fullback in the world, if it wasn't for his injury, of course. And over the next couple of months, he moved so much no one can quite pinpoint to where. Some say he was in the USA for a while, others say they saw him in Saudi Arabia, but no one is 100% sure. Regardless, sooner than later he was back in Brazil, going from club to club, sometime at Palmeiras where he paid off a kid from the academy to injure him, then Fluminense where he supposedly earned their trust by taking the blame for a crime committed by one of the team's star players, and of course, he couldn't play if he was too busy going to court, and eventually, he realized it was time for another major stunt. He needed another credibility boost, so, according to him, he moved to Mexico for 3 years, playing at El Puebla. By the time he came back, he had a million other stories. He would say that he played so well that one time after a match, the president handed him the keys to his Ferrari and the keys to a motel where he got to spend some time with none other than his secretary. Very clearly, a 100% legitimate story. Regardless, he did it. Soon after all of that, he was once again looking for clubs to take him on loan. First came America, where he claimed they had finally found the root of his injuries, and it was, lo and behold, a tooth. Not even gonna try to explain that one. What matters is that 3 clubs later he was at Botafogo, and man oh man did he get into trouble. If you think Castor was bad, then let me introduce you to the newly appointed Botafogo president, Emil Pinheiro. He was Castor's biggest rival when it came to illegal gambling. In fact, he was so much richer and bigger than him that Castor owed him millions. To the point the only way he could pay him was by lending him his own players, which led Botafogo to a meteoric rise. They hadn't won anything since the 70s, but after just 1 year with him as president, they were state champions. But Emil was not just richer than Castor, he was also an even stranger character. Absurd, really. So, how can I say this in a way so that YouTube won't hate this whole video? We did not wee. So he had a surgery to get a pump implant, but for some reason the thing didn't seem to have an off button, if you catch my drift. They literally called him the bionic penis. Again, I wish I was joking. Regardless, as you might imagine, if it was always on, he had to keep it busy, and being 70 years old, finding girls who were up for it wasn't easy, but Kaiser was the greatest wingman on earth, and as long as he did well at that job, Emil didn't seem to care what he did on the pitch, and so he stayed at Botafogo for 5 whole years. By the end of it all, Kaiser was a glorified pimp, not just for Emil, but for the players as well. Every night at the hotel, he would fill an entire floor with girls from all over the place, the players would sneak in, and it was complete debauchery. Kaiser would even go on to say, "I ruled that club. It was Kaiser FC. I think that KFC in the United States was inspired by me." As you can see, he never stopped, and around that time the stories got to a whole new level. He said he was a sex addict, that he had been with 2,000 women, that he had partied with Berlusconi in Milan, you know, in that kind of party we all know Berlusconi enjoyed very much. He said he went to the Oscars after parties, he even claimed he was friends with Robert De Niro. As Bebeto once said, his stories were so good you didn't even want to tell him that you didn't believe him. And speaking of people who really wanted to believe him, let's talk about his girlfriend. She only ever watched him play on tape, and she went 15 years before she found out that the guy in the tapes Kaiser used to show her was another Carlos Henrique who also played at Vasco and had the same haircut. But I know what you're all craving right now. You want to know how it all came to an end, huh? Well, Kaiser was at Vasco once again. They were so amazed at his seemingly everlasting injury that they even hired a witch doctor to try and fix him, and well, nothing, of course, but still, he was fit enough to tour every single TV show in the country until he made it to Mesa Redonda, the biggest sports show in Brazil. Everyone was watching. Everyone. And so when Kaiser decided to gift a jersey from back in the Ajaccio days to the host, there was someone who didn't like that. Fabio Barros, the guy who supposedly put in a word for him at Ajaccio. Well, apparently, that wasn't the case at all. The story was much different. According to him, Kaiser had never even been to France, let alone play for Ajaccio. All that had happened is that they met at a nightclub, became friends, Kaiser asked all he could about how it was like to play there, and then asked him for some memorabilia and took some pictures while wearing Fabio's old kit in a local football pitch. It was all a gigantic con. Remember, he needed the credibility of having played in Europe. Regardless, Kaiser insisted Fabio was lying. After all, Alexandre Couto had undoubtedly played for Ajaccio and he corroborated every single one of Kaiser's stories. So, who was telling the truth? Alexandre's claims allowed Kaiser to go on conning a few more clubs, but more than a decade later, it became clear that it was Fabio, of course. The second journalists began pressing Alexandre over the subject, he completely folded, admitting he just liked to indulge Kaiser's fantasies because he was a fun guy. Kaiser, on the other hand, never fully admitted to it. Fabio even says he thinks Kaiser truly believes in his own fantasies at this point. When the journalists finally interviewed Kaiser at his home, they found a different man. He was completely broke now. They asked him if he was proud of the life he lived, and he said, "No, I've been massively damaged all my life. I was on the run because if I stopped to think for a second, I hated my own life. They taught me I could either be a sucker or a scammer, so I made my choice. I grew up with an adoptive mom, an alcoholic who weighed 200 kilos and died because of that. Then I moved in with my elderly aunts. They were so poor, you have no idea. And then a girl shows up, pregnant. How could I be someone's father? I didn't deserve it. I didn't even deserve to be someone's son. I could have been normal, had a wife, a kid. Carlos Henrique was a real person, but Kaiser, he only existed because of Renato Gaúcho. He did everything for me, and he would have done more if only I wasn't embarrassed to let him see me at this point. I never harmed anyone. I never took anything from anybody, even though life took a lot from me. If you think I'm a bad person, then ask yourself why for 20 years no player ever exposed me. They all kept my secrets because they could see I was good." The only photo at Kaiser's house was one of him at the beach with Renato and his son. I think that says a lot if you're questioning, like many, if this sub-story is just another con. Today, Kaiser is traveling the world telling his story when he has some free time, and on his more regular days, he works as a personal trainer. But of course, he only works with women.